Miss Marple and the Bridesmaid Who Disappeared, Chapter 1. A perfect wedding. Until Marley Combe had never seen a wedding quite like the one planned at the Grand Marleycombe Hall. It wasn't just because the bride, Eleanor Kingsley, came from the local gentry, or because her family had hosted garden parties since the reign of Queen Victoria. It was because this particular marriage, the union of Eleanor and the dashing young solicitor, Thomas Brabham, had all the trimmings of a village fairy tale. Except, of course, fairy tales don't usually end with someone vanishing into thin air. It began, as these things often do, with a morning that felt too beautiful to last. The gardens were in full summer bloom. Swallows darted through warm air, and the villagers, dressed in their Sunday best, sipped lemon barley and commented on how radiant the bride looked. The bridesmaids, 5 of them, flitted about like pastel butterflies, each more cheerful than the last. Among them was young Alice Bridger, barely 19, fresh-faced and full of shy energy. She was a local girl, not for money, but chosen, because Eleanor had taken a liking to her during a parish fundraiser. Some whispered it was charity. Others said it was genuine friendship. The ceremony was to be held at 11:30. By 10:45, everything was in place. Except Alice. She was simply gone. Her dress hung untouched on a padded hanger in the West Wing dressing room. Her shoes remained neatly aligned beneath it. A half-eaten piece of toast and a cup of cooling tea sat on the vanity. But of the girl herself, no trace. Not a note, not a word, not a sound on at first. There was polite confusion. "I dare say she's gotten lost in the gardens," suggested one of the older bridesmaids with a laugh. "Perhaps." "She felt ill," offered the maid, looking uncertain. But 10 minutes turned into 20. Then 30. Panic began to creep in, as it always does. Quietly at first, then all at once. By 11:30, the bride was weeping behind a rosewood screen, her veil forgotten on the floor. By noon, the vicar had cleared his throat 4 separate times and offered to postpone the service. By 1:30, the local constable had been summoned. It wasn't till nearly 1 o'clock, as the guests milled about awkwardly under the strained smiles of servants carrying trays of champagne, that someone suggested Miss Marple. She had been sitting quietly on a wrought-iron bench beneath a lilac tree, knitting a deep crimson scarf and pretending not to notice the commotion. But her pale blue eyes missed nothing. Not the way the maid looked nervously toward the West Wing, not the way the groom seemed a touch too calm, and certainly not the moment when Eleanor's father whispered something urgent to the butler, and received a stiff nod in return. Miss Marple, as ever, observed without interfering. Not yet, but inside her mind, a pattern was already forming, a pattern she had seen before in other villages, in other tragedies, hidden beneath the surface of polite English life. And though no one had said it aloud, Miss Marple understood what most of them had not yet dared to consider. This wasn't a case of a missing bridesmaid. It was the beginning of a murder. Chapter 2. Whispered in the hedges, the search for Alice. Bridger began with politeness and ended with something far more desperate. By the time the sun had shifted past its peak and long shadows stretched across the lawn, the wedding had been quietly postponed. No one said the word canceled. That would make it real. Instead, the guests were gently ushered out with murmured apologies and half-hearted promises that a new date would be announced soon. No one believed that. Not really. Back inside Marleycombe Hall, Constable Fred Batley had taken charge, or at least attempted to. He was a stout man with flushed cheeks and a mustache that twitched when he was nervous, which it often was. This, he knew, was far beyond the usual livestock complaints or missing bicycle cases he was used to. A missing young woman at a wedding? That would be in the Telegraph, surely. "I'll need a full list of guests," he said, puffing out his chest, "and anyone who is in the house this morning. Every servant, every vendor. The butler, Mr. Calthorpe, nodded stiffly and handed him a handwritten list. No signs of forced entry. He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't leave the grounds, at least not by the front. So where the devil did she go? Outside, the village buzzed like a disturbed beehive dot at Mrs. Thistle's tea shop. Two of the older women from the church committee leaned close over a shared scone. "I told you something was off about that girl," whispered Mrs. Penelope Dawes, who'd once run the floral committee with military precision, always looking over her shoulder. "Nonsense," said Miss Harris, who taught piano. "She was just shy. It's nerves. Bridesmaids always flutter. Well, shy or not, she's vanished into thin air. And on the morning of the wedding? You can't tell me that's not odd." By mid-afternoon, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. Some swore she'd run off with a secret lover. Others thought she'd fallen into the lake. A few muttered darker theories, things best not said aloud. But Miss Marple listened quietly. She had taken her usual seat at the window table of the Rose and Ivy, sipping Earl Grey while the world outside crumbled into murmurs. To most, she looked simply like an old woman at rest. But her mind was active, sharp, and entirely focused. Alice Bridger had no reason to run away. That was the first thing. She had no family left, orphaned at 14, raised by an aunt who now lived in Sussex. She had been working part-time at the village library and was well liked by everyone, even the more difficult sorts. But what struck Miss Marple most was how convenient the timing had been. If a girl were to vanish quietly, she thought, what better moment than the chaos before a wedding? Doors opening and shutting, people coming and going, voices rising and falling. It was the perfect storm for a disappearance. But what if it hadn't been her plan? What if she hadn't disappeared at all? Miss Marple rose slowly and walked the lane back toward Marleycombe Hall. She didn't intend to interfere, not officially. The police would bluster and search and file their reports. That was their way. Her way was quieter, slower, but far more precise. By the time she reached the great iron gates, dusk had begun to fall. A young footman let her in without question. Everyone knew Miss Marple. She was the village's quiet conscience. Inside the hall, things were subdued. The bride had locked herself in her room. The groom paced the library, too agitated to sit, and the parents, red-eyed and whispering, were in the drawing-room with the constable. Miss Marple did not interrupt. Instead, she wandered the west wing corridor, the place where Alice had last been seen. The dressing-room was untouched, still warm with the faint scent of lavender soap and curling iron. The toast was still there, the tea cold, a bobby pin on the floor, a single footprint smudged into the rug. She bent slightly and examined it. Men's, too large to be. Alice's, fresh. How very curious. Outside the room, she found the maid, Mary, hovering like a shadow. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I'm so frightened." "There's no need for that, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "But tell me, did you see Alice this morning?" Mary hesitated. "Yes, well, no. I brought her tea at 8, as usual. She was in her robe, sitting at the vanity. Said she hadn't slept well. Did she seem nervous?" Mary bit her lip. "Not nervous, just thoughtful, like she was trying to make a decision, or remember something. Then she asked me to bring her the dress in half an hour. But when I came back, she was gone," Miss Marple finished. Softly, Mary nodded. "And I swear, miss, the window was open, but she wouldn't have climbed out. It's a drop." Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the hall. Something was wrong here. Not loud, not visible, but off. Like a curtain pulled slightly askew. And though no one else had realized it yet, not the constable, not the family, not the guests, She knew one thing with quiet certainty. Alice Bridger hadn't left the room of her own accord. She had been taken. Chapter 3. Shadows Beneath Silk by Morning. Marley Combe had changed. The warm-hearted village, known for its garden shows and baking competitions, had grown a shell of suspicion. Curtains twitched earlier. Conversations ended quicker. Strangers were eyed longer. For all its roses and trellises, Marley Combe now held its breath, as if the very soil knew something terrible had occurred and was waiting nervously for the truth to bloom. The wedding decorations still fluttered in the breeze. Streamers, forgotten in the confusion, hung limply from the wrought iron gates of Marley Combe Hall. The silk canopy in the garden sagged under the weight of dew. Flowers wilted in their vases. It all looked like the aftermath of a celebration. No one had enjoyed. Constable Batley was back at the hall before 8. "I've put out a notice to the surrounding towns," he told Thomas Brabham, the would-be groom. "No one matching her description's been seen on the trains or buses. No cabbies recall picking her up. No one's checked into any inns." Thomas was pale, his eyes bruised from lack of sleep. Why would she leave? She was happy. She had no reason. Batley raised a hand. "I know, son. Believe me, I do. But we've got no evidence of foul play. No ransom, no blood, no screams. She might have left for personal reasons." Miss Marple, who had quietly entered the drawing-room unnoticed, finally spoke. "That seems unlikely, Constable," she said softly. "A girl doesn't leave behind a wedding dress and half a piece of toast unless she's interrupted or afraid." Batley flushed. He respected Miss Marple. Everyone did. But his pride still bristled when she pointed out what he already half suspected. "I'm not ruling anything out," he muttered. "But we've no cause to suspect a crime." Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. "Often, Constable, crimes begin with very little cause indeed." Later that afternoon, Eleanor Kingsley emerged from her room for the first time since the incident. She descended the staircase slowly, as if each step cost her something. Miss Marple found her in the music room, standing near the grand piano with its lace-covered top. "I'm sorry to intrude, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, "but I wondered if we might talk for just a moment." Eleanor turned. Her face was wan, eyes rimmed with salt. But she nodded. "She was my friend," Eleanor said. "People say she wasn't, that I chose her out of pity. But I didn't. Alice made me laugh. She always saw things, little things. No one noticed. Once she pointed out that the vicar's wife always picked cakes she didn't like, so others could have their favorites. Who notices things like that?" "People who see more than they say," Miss Marple replied. "I've always found them rather interesting." "She didn't have much," Eleanor continued. "No fine clothes or inheritance. But she had this quiet strength. That morning, I saw her for a few moments. She came to my room early, before the others were awake. She was holding a little velvet box." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A box?" Eleanor nodded. "I thought it was jewelry. A brooch, perhaps." She looked troubled. "Said she'd found something that belonged to someone else. Something she wasn't sure she should return." "What did you say?" "I told her to do what felt right." She smiled, then she hugged me. And that was the last time I saw her. Later, Miss Marple sat alone in the gardens, her hands still, but her thoughts racing. A velvet box. Something hidden. Something found. A simple girl, not prone to drama or games, suddenly unsure of what to do. That, Miss Marple thought, was not random. And as the light faded, she saw the butler, Mr. Calthorpe, step discreetly into the gardens. South Hedge Path. Moments later, the groom, Thomas Brabham, followed, hands in his pockets. They spoke quietly, too far for her to hear. But their posture said enough. Tension, urgency, secrets. When Calthorpe finally walked away, Thomas remained. For a while, looking out over the pond. He didn't seem like a man mourning a vanished girl. He seemed like a man calculating. Miss Marple stood slowly. The breeze had shifted. The air felt heavier. Alice Bridger hadn't vanished by accident. Someone wanted her gone. And if Miss Marple was correct, and she often was, then Alice had found something she was never meant to see. Chapter 4. The Hairpin in the Heather. B. The third day. The search had turned sour. The official posters now hung in every shop window from Marleycombe to the next 3 villages. Missing. Alice Bridger, age 19. Last seen at Marleycombe Hall on the morning of June 12th. A photograph accompanied it. Alice in a lilac cardigan, her smile shy and genuine, as if surprised someone wanted to take her picture. But smiles don't solve mysteries. And posters rarely bring people back. What they did bring was speculation. She ran off, mark my words, declared Mr. Cartwright at the bakery. Probably couldn't bear the pressure of all those posh folk. Nonsense, said Mrs. Maplethorpe from behind her lace handkerchief. She was taken. No girl leaves a silk dress behind unless someone made her. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone. Except Miss Marple, who listened not to the words, but to the patterns beneath them. That morning, the groundskeeper made a discovery. I didn't think much of it at first. He told Constable Badley, holding out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Just a trinket. Found it half buried in the heather near the north fence. It was a silver hairpin, delicately shaped like a rose, with a single pearl in the center. Eleanor gasped when she saw it. That was Alice's. I gave it to her the day she agreed to be my bridesmaid. She wore it every time we were together. It seemed, finally, like a lead. Batley paced beside the flower beds with visible excitement. North side of the estate, you say? Well, could be she fled that way. Or was taken, perhaps. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Curious, she said mildly. Batley turned. Beg your pardon? I was only thinking, Constable, she said, resuming her rhythm, that the heather patch near the north fence isn't a place one strolls through. Brambles, hidden dips, very untidy. A girl in slippers would never choose that path. Not unless she were chasing something, or being chased. Batley's face fell slightly. And more than that, Miss Marple added, I happened to see that patch yesterday. It had just been raked. Batley blinked. Raked? She nodded. By the gardener. I watched him do it. If that pin were there 2 days ago, it would have been turned up. But it wasn't, which means it was placed there after the fact. You think someone's planted it? He asked slowly. I think, said Miss Marple gently, that someone wants us to believe Alice went that way. Meanwhile, back at the hall, tensions had grown. Thomas Brabham was spending more time with Mr. Kingsley than with his grieving fiancée. More curious still, the groom had taken to speaking in hushed tones with the butler, Mr. Calthorpe. Meetings that ended abruptly whenever a door creaked or a maid passed too close. Miss Marple found Calthorpe in the linen room later that afternoon, folding napkins with the precision of a soldier. I imagine this is a difficult time for everyone, she said softly, but especially for you. You've served this family a long time. Calthorpe looked up, guarded. 32 years, madam. Then you must know the staff quite well. Did anyone seem nervous? Upset before the wedding? He hesitated. The girl, he said after a moment. Alice, sweet girl. But something changed in her about a week before. She'd walk past me in the hall and forget to say good morning. Once I found her in the library, staring at the Kingsley's family portrait, just staring, as if something had struck her. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did you ask her about it? I did. She said she'd discovered something odd. Did she say what? No, madam. just ... that it wasn't what it seemed. By twilight, the constable was announcing his grand theory, that Alice had panicked and run into the woods beyond the north fence, perhaps even drowned in the river, past the trees. It was plausible. It was clean, and it was wrong. Miss Marple knew it. She knew it the way you know when rain is coming. The air changes. The silence grows. Someone had planted that pin. Someone wanted the police looking in the wrong direction, which meant, she thought grimly, that someone was buying time. And if they were buying time ... then perhaps Alice Bridger wasn't dead yet, but she would be soon, if Miss Marple didn't uncover the truth before the killer buried it for good. Chapter 5. The photograph. In the attic, the following day dawned gray and low-hanging, the kind of weather that made Marleycomb's lanes feel older than they were, as if the village itself had curled inward. By now, the wedding had faded from memory. What remained was the girl, Alice. Her name lingered like mist on doorsteps, in tea-shops, in hesitant glances across the churchyard. The dress she never wore still hung in the dressing room at the hall, like a ghost in silk. Miss Marple, however, had not lingered. She'd spent the morning in the parish office, speaking with the church archivist, and then taken a slow walk past the post office and up the gravel path to the Kingsley estate. Not through the grand front doors, but around the back to the servants' entrance, where the real stories lived. She had a name now, a name Alice Bridger had not spoken aloud in years. Miss Marple found Eleanor in the garden, staring at the pond with a vacant expression. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you could help me with something." Eleanor turned. "Of course. I understand there's an attic room, the old nursery. Would it be possible to see it?" Eleanor blinked. "The attic? Why on earth?" "I believe Alice may have gone up there recently, and if she did, she was looking for something." The attic was reached by a narrow staircase concealed behind the library shelves. It creaked as they climbed. The air grew still and musty, and dust drifted in golden beams from the small round window at the far. And everything was as it had been decades ago. Rocking horse, faded wallpaper, a shelf of forgotten books. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting details others might miss. A candle stub recently burned, a footprint in the dust, and something else. The edge of an old photograph sticking out from beneath a loose board under the toy chest. Lifted it carefully. A black and white portrait, slightly yellowed, showing a man and a woman standing stiffly beside a prom. Their expressions were formal. The woman wore pearls. The man had a hand protectively on the prom's handle. Miss Marple turned the photo over. There, in faint ink, were 3 names: Henry Kingsley, Margaret Kingsley, and baby Charlotte. 1911. Miss Marple's voice was low. "Eleanor, ... Did your grandparents have a daughter before your father?" Eleanor frowned. "Charlotte? I think ... yes. But she died before I was born. No one ever spoke of her. My grandfather never recovered, apparently." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where was Charlotte buried?" I don't know." Eleanor whispered. "There's no grave in our family plot." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Secrets buried under family pride are often the deadliest. And in the Kingsley household, pride was inherited like silver. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and opened a box she kept locked in her sitting-room cupboard. Inside were newspaper clippings, letters, notes from old cases, patterns she'd seen before. She sifted through until she found what she'd been looking for. A 1929 report from a Dorset orphanage, a fire, a lost record, a young girl admitted under unknown circumstances. Alice Bridger, age 4, parents deceased, no known relatives, except perhaps ... 1. Miss Marple put down the paper. her heart heavy with realization. If Alice had discovered she was a Kingsley by blood, a descendant of the hidden daughter, Charlotte, then she would have had a legitimate claim. A dangerous one. One that could unseat the inheritance. One that could ruin the wedding. One that someone might kill to silence, not out of hatred, but out of fear. Miss Marple closed the lid of her box. She no longer doubted what had happened to Alice Bridger. She was certain of why. Now, all she had to do was find who. Chapter 6. The letter that never came. The tension inside Marleycombe Hall had thickened like storm clouds. By the sixth day, it no longer felt like a home. The rooms were too quiet, the air too still. Even the servants had grown hushed, as if sound itself might crack some terrible truth wide open. The Kingsleys barely left the drawing room. Eleanor moved like a shadow. Thomas Brabham, the once confident groom, had grown restless, short-tempered, always disappearing for long stretches, then returning with a face too blank to be innocent. And Miss Marple? She simply watched. It was not her nature to accuse. It was her nature to notice. She began with something simple. "Thomas," she said, sweetly that morning over tea, "did Alice ever mention anything about family?" Thomas looked startled, then shrugged. No, she didn't. I don't believe she had any, did she?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. She was very quiet, wasn't she? The sort who might keep things to herself. Thomas shifted in his seat. Perhaps. But she was just a girl, good-hearted, not the sort to stir trouble. Miss Marple smiled. But you see, it isn't always the loud ones who do the stirring. Later that day, the village postmistress stopped Miss Marple outside the greengrocer's. "Funny thing," she said, glancing about first. "Not sure it means anything, but... Well, Alice came in the day before the wedding, posted a letter." "Miss..." Marple's eyes brightened. "To whom?" "That's just it. I don't know. But it was express post. Said it was urgent." "Did you notice the name?" The woman hesitated, embarrassed. "I only saw the town. Chichester. Fancy script. Couldn't quite make out the surname. Chichester. That rang a bell. Miss Marple returned home and pulled out the orphanage records. Again. There, listed as the last known address for Alice's aunt, the woman who raised her after the fire, Mrs. Sylvia Moore, Chichester. But there had been no response. No one from Chichester had come forward. No one had arrived. No return. Letters. The letter had never reached its destination. Or perhaps it had, and someone had intercepted it. That evening, Miss Marple wandered the back gardens of the Hall. Not aimlessly. She had noticed something during her earlier visit to the attic, a faint scent of tobacco clinging to the nursery curtains. Not pipe smoke, something sharper, imported. And now, here in the garden, behind the gardener's shed, she found the stub, a crushed cigarette end, with lipstick smeared at the tip. Not Eleanor's shade. Too dark. She slipped it into her bag. As twilight fell, she returned to the hall one final time. Eleanor sat by the fireplace, staring into nothing. Her eyes were dry now, but hollow. "I keep wondering," she said softly as Miss Marple entered. "What if she never meant to stay? What if she planned to leave, and I just didn't see it?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "I don't believe she meant to disappear at all." "Then where is she?" Miss Marple hesitated. "Tell me, did you notice any change in Thomas before the wedding?" Eleanor blinked. "Change? He's been distant since, has he not?" Eleanor hesitated. "I thought it was grief. Or shame. But... yes, I suppose he has." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes grief hides guilt. Or fear. Or both." Eleanor gripped the arm of the chair. "You think Thomas?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone in this house feared Alice more than they loved her. That she knew something. That she discovered something. Eleanor's voice broke. She told me just once. She said, "Not everything in this house is what it seems." I laughed. I thought she meant the decorators. Miss Marple reached out, placed a steady hand on Eleanor's. She meant the people. Outside, a storm began to roll in from the hills. Inside, Miss Marple's thoughts moved faster now. The letter, the cigarette, the false trail of the hairpin, the missing family history. A groom whose emotions didn't quite fit. She had nearly enough, but not quite. One more thread needed tugging. And when it did, everything would unravel. Chapter 7. The body in the boathouse. The rain had begun during the night, not the gentle sort Marleycombe was used to, but a cold, needling downpour that seemed to soak into the bones of the village itself. Trees bowed under its weight. The river ran faster. The paths grew slick and treacherous. Miss Marple had always believed that bad weather brought things to the surface, loose tiles, fraying tempers, and secrets. That morning it brought something else, a scream. Sharp, guttural, echoing across the estate grounds. It came from the edge of the lake, from the boathouse. By the time Miss Marple arrived, soaked to the skin beneath her shawl, a small crowd had gathered. The gardener, the footman, 2 maids clinging to each other, and Constable Batley, trying to keep them all at bay with a shaking hand and a red face. "Stand back now," he barked, though his voice quivered. "This is a crime scene." Miss Marple didn't need to push forward. She saw everything from the edge. Inside the open boathouse, lying in a heap against the wall, was a body. But it wasn't Alice. It was Mr. Calthorpe, the Kingsley's trusted butler of 32 years. Face pale, shirt soaked through, head bloodied from a blow, and beside him, half crumpled and sodden, was the velvet box. The discovery rippled through the hall like a dropped teacup. Mrs. Kingsley fainted. Eleanor retreated to her room again, the old trauma reignited. Even Thomas seemed truly shaken this time, but Miss Marple noted something strange. Not grief, not horror. Annoyance. Like a man whose plans had been interrupted. Later that afternoon, the coroner arrived from Dorchester. Time of death was estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. No signs of a struggle, just the head injury. The rest of the boathouse was undisturbed, save for some scuffed footprints on the wooden floor. Constable Batley found something else, too, something he brought to Miss Marple with the quiet shame of a man realizing he was out of his depth. A note, he said, holding it in his thick fingers. In the butler's pocket, unfinished. She read it silently. "To whomever finds this, I can no longer carry the burden." What she knew, I knew too. But I was too afraid to speak. Now it's too late. If anything should happen to me, look to, it ended there. No name, no signature. Ink left in the pen. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, drying her stockings, thinking. Calthorpe had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough to endanger him. Had he confessed something to Alice? Had he told her a story she wasn't supposed to hear? And what of the box? Why was it found beside his body now, when Alice had it the morning she vanished? One possibility rose above the rest, cold and clear. The killer had the box. The killer planted it again. Why? To frame the butler. Perhaps, but more likely, the killer had discovered what was inside and wanted it gone. Miss Marple stared into the fire. Everything was speeding up. Now, first a disappearance. Now a death. The killer was growing reckless. And soon, if she didn't act, they would kill again. Chapter 8. Secrets wrapped in velvet. Box sat on the table like a confession, waiting to be heard. Miss Marple had requested it from Constable Batley, who, though uncertain, complied with a shrug and a mutter about gut feelings and Marple's nose. She opened it with care. Inside was no necklace, No ring, no brooch. Nothing that sparkled. Just 3 items. A folded birth certificate, fragile with age. A silver locket, tarnished but delicately engraved. A newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. Began with the certificate. Charlotte Kingsley. Born April 1911. Mother, Margaret Kingsley. Father, Henry Kingsley. Daughter, Alice Charlotte Bridger. In the margins, barely legible, a notation. Adopted out following death of mother, 1915. Miss. Marple's hands still dot, it was true. Alice wasn't a bridesmaid by coincidence. She was a Kingsley, a blood relation, hidden behind a century of silence. She unfolded the clipping next dot. It was from the Chichester Herald, dated 1931. Unmarried mother dies in fire. Infant rescued. Tragic tale. A fire at a small boarding house. A young woman perished. Her child, miraculously, survived. No name mentioned, but Miss Marple could read between lines, and family shame. Finally, the locket. It contained a single photo. A man, young, serious, and a woman with familiar eyes. Alice's eyes. Miss. Marple closed the lid. The truth was heavy, but simple. Alice had discovered her identity. And with it, her inheritance. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Thomas Brabham. She found him in the study, pretending to read, though the book in his lap was upside down. "I wonder," she said gently, "if I might ask something rather delicate." He smiled stiffly. "Of course, Miss Marple. Did you know about Alice's past?" He blinked. "No, I don't think anyone did they? But you spoke to Mr. Calthorpe the day before he died. In the garden, quite urgently." Thomas hesitated. He told me he was concerned about Eleanor. Said she wasn't coping well. That's all." "Of course," said Miss Marple, her tone light. "And did he say anything about Alice?" Thomas's fingers twitched. No, why would he? Just that he was one of the few who knew the Kingsley family history intimately, would have been aware of. Missing branches. There was a long pause. Then Thomas leaned back in his chair, forced a laugh. "This is all terribly dramatic. Isn't it? You're making it sound like one of those novels." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Sometimes I wonder if novels are closer to the truth than we realize." She left him with a seed of fear, not accusation, not confrontation. Just enough truth to unsettle, because Miss Marple knew something Thomas did not. The guilty always reveal themselves, not when you accuse them, but when they believe you almost know. It rattles them, makes them careless. At her cottage, she made a quiet note in her diary. Alice knew. Calthorpe helped her. Thomas discovered it. Perhaps not at first, but eventually. He stands to lose the most. Eleanor, the Kingsley fortune, his position. He's too smart to act. In panic. But panic is creeping in. She underlined 2 words. Next move. Because soon, he would make one. And when he did, she'd be waiting. Chapter 9. The chessboard beneath the teacups. Thomas Brabham was unusually cheerful at breakfast. He had shaved, dressed crisply, and joined the family at the table for the first time in days. His conversation was light, overly so, touching on weather, local cricket scores, and a rather forced remark about Eleanor's roses blooming early this season. Miss Marple noticed, as she sipped her tea from the far end of the room, there was something off in his movements, the way he buttered his toast with deliberate slowness, as though waiting for something. His eyes flicked, just once, toward the clock on the mantel. He was performing, for someone, for her. She let him believe it was working. Later that morning, Miss Marple accidentally encountered him in the west corridor, near the old library. "Oh, Thomas," she said sweetly, "I do hope I didn't frighten you yesterday with all my questions. I know I can sound terribly nosy." He gave her a half laugh. No, no. I just found the whole thing strange. I mean, what does a box and a locket prove, really? Not very much, she agreed with a nod. Still, secrets do have a way of crawling out, don't they? Thomas's smile stiffened. Before he could answer, she added casually, "Of course, it's fortunate the locket was found in the boathouse. Otherwise, no one would believe Mr. Calthorpe had anything to hide." Thomas's jaw twitched, just barely. "You believe he planted it himself?" "Perhaps," she said lightly. "Or perhaps someone planted it for him. After all, if the box disappeared from Alice's possession and reappeared only after Calthorpe's death, one might say it had a journey." She tilted her head and looked up at him with quiet blue eyes. Thomas hesitated, then smiled. "Miss Marple, you really should write novels." She chuckled. "Oh, I leave that sort of drama to others." But her heart was beating just a little faster, because in that moment he had blinked, not just literally, he had blinked inside his performance. She had touched something. A nerve. That evening, an anonymous tip arrived at the village constable's office. A note, typed, plain. "You'll find what you're looking for behind the garden wall. Old well." Constable Batley, excited and puffed with importance, gathered 2 officers and rushed to the site behind Marleycombe Hall. They lowered a torch and found nothing, no body, no belongings, just water, darkness, and dead leaves. A deliberate misdirection. A trick. Miss Marple stood by silently as Batley muttered about pranksters. She didn't need to guess who had sent the note. Thomas was watching her, and that meant something crucial. He believed she was close, and he was trying to throw her off. That night, as rain tapped softly against her window, Miss Marple sat with her diary once more. "He's testing me, planting decoys, whispering clues to confuse the path. But he's not clever enough. He's acting, not thinking. It's beginning to unravel." She paused, then wrote, "Tomorrow, I tell Eleanor everything. Gently. It's time, because Miss Marple knew something the killer did not. He was not just playing against an old woman. He was playing against time, and he was already losing. Chapter 10. What the roses remembered, the rain had broken overnight, leaving the garden soaked and glistening. Raindrops clung to every leaf and petal, catching the sunlight like silent jewels. Marleycombe Hall looked beautiful again, at least from a distance. But beauty, Miss Marple knew, was often a disguise. So were families. That morning, she asked Eleanor to walk with her. No maids, no chaperones. Just the 2 of them. They strolled slowly along the gravel path near the rose border, silence stretching between them like an unspoken thread. Miss Marple waited until they had reached the far bench, the one tucked beneath the rose arch Eleanor's mother had planted in her youth. "Eleanor," she said gently, "I believe it's time I told you what I know." Eleanor looked at her, pale and drawn. "Please," she said. "Just say it." Miss Marple told her everything. About the velvet box. The birth certificate, the locket, the family tree that no longer matched its portrait. About Alice Bridger, who was not a poor orphaned librarian, but the granddaughter of Henry Kingsley, your cousin. She thought, but did not say. And then quietly, about the danger Alice had wandered into the moment she uncovered the truth. Eleanor sat perfectly still, didn't weep, but her hands curled into her lap until the knuckles went white. "Pentonus?" she whispered at last. Miss Marple hesitated. "I believe," she said softly, "he discovered it too. Not at first, perhaps, but later. Maybe he read something, overheard something. Maybe Alice trusted him enough to confide in him. But once he knew, and once he realized what it meant for you, for him. She let the sentence hang, unfinished. Eleanor's breath trembled. "He wouldn't hurt her," she said, but without conviction. He's ambitious, proud, but not that. Miss Marple didn't argue. Instead, she asked gently, "Have you ever felt he was keeping something from you?" Eleanor looked away. "Lately, he's been hollow, like he's pretending to be who I want him to be." "That's often the most dangerous sort," Miss Marple said. "The ones who know how to wear other people's love like a mask." They sat for a long minute. Birdsong drifted in from the trees. Then Eleanor asked, "Is Alice dead?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. Finally, "I don't know, but I don't believe she was meant to vanish. I believe she became a threat, and someone tried to make that threat disappear. That doesn't always mean death. Sometimes it means being locked away, hidden, silenced." Eleanor's eyes flickered. "You think she's still alive?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "there's still time to find her, but only if we act carefully." Eleanor nodded once, and slowly then something in her face changed. Resolve, steel beneath the sorrow. "Then tell me what you need." "Am to do." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat alone again, not with her knitting, but with her notebook. She drew 2 columns, what we know and what we don't. Then she underlined one phrase: Alice trusted someone enough to show them the truth. She thought of Eleanor's heartbreak. She thought of Thomas's performance. And she thought of something else. The moment Alice had stared at the family portrait, days before the wedding. She wasn't looking at people. She was looking for herself. Miss Marple closed the notebook. Tomorrow, the trap would be set. She had everything she needed, all except one thing: Alice, and if she was still alive. Time was running out. Chapter 11. The invitation no one expected next morning brought a curious change in the household. For the first time since the day of the vanished wedding, Eleanor descended the staircase wearing color, soft lavender, the same shade Alice once wore in the garden. Her hair was tied back simply, her chin lifted just enough to look like herself again. Thomas was already in the drawing room, stirring sugar into coffee with mechanical precision. He looked up, and for a moment, something unreadable passed between them. "You're up early," he said, forcing a smile. "I thought I'd take a walk," Eleanor replied, voice composed. "And I had a letter to write." She left before he could ask anything more, but he wanted to Miss Marple, sitting silently in the sunroom, with a teacup and a clear view of the hall, noted his reaction. His eyes narrowed. He was losing control, and he knew it. The letter Eleanor had written was not for the post. It was for him. That afternoon, she left it, unsigned, tucked inside the drawer of Thomas's desk. He would find it. She knew. He always searched her things when he thought she didn't notice. The note said, "I know about Alice. I know about the locket. Meet me by the south hedge at midnight, or I go to the police." It was bait, wrapped in just enough truth to provoke. Panic. Miss Marple had written the exact words in Eleanor's hand, carefully avoiding any true accusations, only implications. If Thomas was guilty, he would bite, and he would come. At 10 minutes to midnight, Miss Marple stood hidden behind the gardener's shed, just east of the hedge where the meeting was to occur. She wore dark gloves, a navy shawl, and her keenest expression. Eleanor was not there. She was safe in the vicar's house, sipping cocoa. They had decided, if Thomas was dangerous, she must be nowhere near. Miss Marple waited. And then, just after midnight, she saw him. Thomas. Walking fast. Number. Coat. Eyes sharp. He reached the hedge and stopped, scanning the shadows. No one. He pulled something from his coat pocket. A small bottle. Clear glass. Pale liquid. Miss Marple's breath caught. He wasn't just coming to talk. He was coming to finish what he started. She stepped forward, quietly. "Thomas." He spun, startled, face pale, fury barely concealed. "Miss Marple," he said, voice tight. You shouldn't be out in the dark at your age. Neither should you, she replied calmly. Especially not carrying chloroform. His mouth opened, closed. She saw it, the exact second. His charm dropped, and his calculation returned. I don't know what you think. I think, she said, stepping closer, that you've been playing a long game. One that started the moment Alice came to this house. You knew. You learned the truth, and you couldn't afford it to surface. He backed away slightly. Calthorpe tried to warn her. That's why he died. And you've been trying to remove anyone else who knew. She stopped, just inches away now. You even tried to lead the police to an empty well. You thought we were stupid. Thomas exhaled slowly and smiled. None of this will stick. There's no proof. Miss Marple looked up at him, softly, almost kindly. Oh, but there is. From behind the shed, 2 constables stepped into view, and behind them, Eleanor Dot very much alive, very much listening. Thomas didn't run. He didn't have to. He just looked at Eleanor once and said nothing. She didn't speak either. There was nothing left to say. 12. Beneath the willow tree, they found her the next morning, alive, cold. Shaken, but alive. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the old gardener's cottage, long disused and covered with tangled ivy. A place no one had thought to search. Miss Marple had thought of it. She had remembered something Eleanor once said, in passing, about Alice liking the view from the west gardens, near the willow tree. A quiet place. A place to think. She'd gone there often in the days before the wedding. Too often. Thomas had noticed. And so, when she confronted him with the truth, when she told him who she was and what she'd discovered, he didn't kill her. Not quite. He drugged her and hid her. The constables lifted her carefully from the TRAPDO. She was dazed, confused by light and sound. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked. Eleanor ran to her and wrapped her arms around her without hesitation. Oh, Alice, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I should have seen. You weren't meant to, Alice murmured, eyes wet. He was. So gentle. Until he wasn't. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soft as silk. You were very brave, my dear. Alice looked at her. I didn't want to ruin anything. I just wanted to know who I was. And now you do, Miss Marple said gently. And now the world knows too. At the station, Thomas Brabham said very little. He refused a solicitor. Refused to speak in his own defense. When asked why, he simply replied, she was going to take everything. I wasn't going to let her burn down what I built. The irony, Miss Marple thought later, was that Alice had never intended to claim a single thing. She didn't want money. She didn't want land. She wanted family. And in the end, she found it. Not through blood, but through a bond that Thomas could never understand. The wedding never happened. The Kingsleys held a quiet tea. The following Sunday instead, not in mourning, but in relief. A quiet return to something close to peace. Eleanor never wore the engagement ring again. Alice, after a short stay in the hospital, returned to Marleycombe, not as a servant, not as a bridesmaid, but as herself. She and Eleanor became something new, not sisters by blood, but by something far stronger. And Miss Marple? She returned to her garden. There were roses to prune, tea to pour, and a new pattern of humanity to ponder. Because that was always how it went. People smiled. People lied. People hid the worst of themselves behind the best of intentions. But eventually, always, the truth found its way to light. Chapter 13. The silence after. Scandal Marleycombe had returned to normal. Or so it seemed. The bakers opened on time. The postman resumed his cheerful whistling. The hedges were clipped and the lily trimmed. But if you listened closely, in the pews before Sunday service, in the hush of the grocer's queue, you could hear it. Not the story, the after-story, Imagine, locked under the gardener's cottage. Poor Eleanor. Did you see how pale she's been? Miss Marple knew, of course. Always does. Gossip was Marley Comb's second oxygen. And scandal, once it passed, settled like dust in every corner of every home. Alice Bridger walked slowly now. She didn't flinch when people stared, but she didn't smile much either. Some called her brave, some quietly, still called her a servant. But Miss Marple noticed one very important thing. Eleanor walked beside her Dot. They went to the shops together, took tea in the garden, read books aloud on the bench near the willow tree. Dot, and slowly, quietly, the village began to understand that blood didn't define family. Grace did. Dot. Miss Marple, for her part, received a great many thank you cards. One from Eleanor, one from Alice, and even one from the vicar, who wrote in trembling script. I always suspected that Thomas boy wore his confidence like a waistcoat too tightly buttoned. She smiled at that. People did love to believe they'd seen it coming, but they hadn't. Not really. Thomas Brabham had fooled nearly everyone, not with charm, but with correctness. He had said the right things, at the right times, with the right face. That was always the hardest to see through, because true wickedness didn't always shout. Sometimes it smiled politely and handed you your coat. On a warm Thursday, Miss Marple was visited by Inspector Hughes from Dorchester. He sat in her garden with a biscuit in one hand and a look of wonder in his eyes. You always seem to know. He said, No, she replied, spooning sugar into her tea. I only watch, he frowned. Watch what? People, she said. Not just what they say, but what they don't say. What they carry in silence. The tension in their tea drinking. The panic in their politeness. Murder is rarely about hate, Inspector. More often, it's about fear. He looked thoughtful. Fear of being caught? No, fear of losing something. She sipped her tea and added softly, And fear, my dear Inspector, makes fools of the cleverest men. Later that evening, she wrote in her diary, Alice will heal. Eleanor already has. The village will forget in time, or pretend to. But something important happened here. A false man fell. A hidden girl rose. And once again, the truth was found in the small things. A glance, a locket, a lie too clean to be true. She underlined, one final line, the roses remember, even when we forget. Chapter 14. A teacup out of place. It was a golden afternoon in Marleycombe. The sun lay soft over the rooftops, and the bell from St. Mildred's Church tolled 4 times, slow and clear. Miss Marple had taken her tea on the terrace, where the roses now bloomed unbothered, and the bees moved with their usual single-minded contentment. It had been weeks since Alice Bridger had returned home. Thomas Brabham was behind bars awaiting trial, and for most of the village, life had resumed its ordinary rhythm, or tried to, but Miss Marple, as ever, listened to the in-between moments, the half-smiles, the misplaced silences, the unasked questions. That morning, she had visited the market, a routine she never missed on Thursdays, and something had struck her there. A conversation between Mr. Penelagon, the grocer, and Mrs. Leslie, the spinster. With 5 cats and no known hobbies besides judging cucumbers. They spoke in murmurs. Of course, I always thought something was odd about the Calthorpe man, Mrs. Leslie had said. He kept a second bank account, you know. Miss Marple, reaching for a jar of strawberry jam, froze ever so slightly. A second account? Oh, yes, Mrs. Leslie continued, her voice tinged with importance. In Dorchester, my nephew works for the bank. Said he made regular deposits. Quite a bit of money. The grocer snorted. On a butler's wages? They both shook their heads. Miss Marple paid for her jam, smiling politely, but something shifted in her mind. Back at home, she pulled open the small drawer beneath her writing desk. the one where she kept old case notes and village observations tucked between recipes and wool patterns. She found what she was looking for. Receipt, dated 1 week before the wedding, a purchase made at a jeweler's in London. On credit, Dot made by Calthorpe, not for a watch, not for silver, but for a ring, not for himself. Surely Dot, and not for a Kingsley. Miss Marple sat down, frowning slightly. A second account, a secret purchase, and then a man who ended up dead in a boathouse, holding the very box that once belonged to Alice. She had assumed Thomas planted the box. But what if ... what if Calthorpe had taken it? Not to frame Alice, but to protect her. Perhaps he'd been more involved than she thought. Perhaps, in his own quiet, frightened way, Calthorpe had tried to make things right. And someone, Thomas, or another shadow entirely, had silenced him before he could speak. The mystery was solved. Yes, but not complete. And that, Miss Marple thought as she poured another cup of tea, was the nature of things. Mystery never ended. It only quieted for a time, like a kettle left just on the edge of boil. That evening, as she watered the roses, she saw Alice and Eleanor walking arm in arm near the orchard path. They were laughing, not loudly, but freely. Miss Marple smiled. Some mysteries, she decided, were best left unsolved. Because some stories, at last, had found peace. Chapter 15. The letter with no return address. It began with bunting. Bright flags were strung across the high street in crooked lines, and Mr. Dodds from the pub was muttering about ladder splinters. Marley Combe was planning its annual Founders' Day fete, a cheerful tradition involving sponge cake competitions, apple bobbing, and the dubious talents of the village choir. People needed it. After a summer of whispered scandal and locked doors. The village was hungry for normalcy. Laughter returned in small bursts. Children ran freely again. Even Mrs. Leslie seemed marginally less suspicious of strangers. But Miss Marple, as ever, saw what others did not. Normalcy was often a mask. She was sipping her mid-morning tea when it arrived. Plain envelope. No stamp, no sender. Just her name. In tight CURSIVE. Miss Jane Marple. The Elms Marley Combe. Turned it over twice before opening it. Inside, a single sheet of ivory paper. Folded once. She unfolded it carefully. The message was handwritten, but unsigned. What happened to the bridesmaid was only the beginning. She wasn't the only one with a secret. You should ask about the piano tuner who never came back. Miss Marple stared at the words for a long time. The piano tuner? It triggered a faint bell in her memory. Hadn't Mrs. Kingsley mentioned something once? That the piano had fallen out of tune, and no one ever came to fix it, despite the appointment? At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Now it felt like a door opening in a dark hallway. She slipped the note into her journal and began making a fresh list. Bridesmaid disappeared. Butler dead. Room in prison. Piano tuner missing. The trail was supposed to be over, but someone clearly didn't think so. And if that someone had gone to the trouble of leaving a note quietly, privately, then either they were trying to help, or they were trying to distract. Miss Marple closed her book and stood slowly. The fate could wait. There was a piano to investigate. Chapter 16. The man with the case of keys, the Kingsley family's Bechstein piano, sat in the east wing drawing room, elegant, untouched, and slightly flat. Miss Marple had passed by it many times before, but today she paused, ran her fingers softly along the lid, lifted it, played a tentative chord. C-sharp was sour. He was dead. Clearly, no one had tuned it in months. She turned to Eleanor, who stood nearby, watching. Do you happen to recall when it was last serviced? Eleanor blinked, thinking. Yes, the week before the wedding. I remember, because Mummy was annoyed he never came. We had an appointment for Friday morning. And what was his name? Eleanor frowned. Oh, I've no idea. We always used the same man. Quiet, terribly polite. Mr. Littleton, I believe. Arthur Littleton. And he didn't arrive? No. He phoned 2 days before. Or someone did on his behalf. Said he was ill. Miss Marple tilted her head. And has anyone seen him since? At afternoon, she walked to the post office. Miss Gresham, the postmistress, was pleased to see her, and even more pleased to gossip. Oh, Mr. Littleton, she said, when asked. Yes, always rode a little green bicycle. Kept his tools in a red satchel. Never said much. And have you seen him recently? Miss Gresham hesitated. Now that you mention it, no. Not since early summer. Odd. He was regular as clockwork. We all said so. Miss Marple nodded. Another thread. Thin, but curious. She returned home and went straight to her desk. She had kept a clipping from the Dorset Gazette weeks ago. A small item she hadn't looked at twice. Something about a man found unconscious in a field between Marleycombe and Suttonmere. No ID, no money, no bicycle, no name. But now she looked again. The article mentioned a green cloth jacket. A satchel with tools. Miss Marple's heart beat faster. Could it be him? She rang the hospital in Dorchester and made her inquiries. A kindly nurse confirmed what she feared. Yes, he's still here. Head injury. Woke once, then fell into a kind of daze. Doesn't remember his name. No family came forward. Miss Marple thanked her, then sat very still. The implications rippled outward, like cracks in glass. If the real piano tuner had been waylaid, knocked unconscious, who had made the call? Who had claimed he was ill? And why? Miss Marple had seen too many coincidences to believe this was one. Someone had wanted to get into the house under false pretenses. Someone who needed access, quietly, without suspicion. A man with a case of tools. Could carry something else. That night, she revisited her notes from the earlier case. The days before Alice disappeared. Who had been seen where? Who had keys? Who could have planted something or removed it? And suddenly, she remembered something. Eleanor had said Thomas was upset about a locked drawer in the library. Said the key had gone missing, then turned up again. At the time, it had sounded like an ordinary domestic annoyance. Now, it sounded like something far more deliberate. Someone had accessed something they weren't meant to, and used a piano. Tuner's appointment to do it. Miss Marple closed her notebook. She had solved the first crime, but the second was just beginning. Chapter 17. The tune he couldn't play. Dorchester General was a quiet place on Tuesday mornings. Miss Marple was shown to a small room with pale green walls and the faint scent of antiseptic. The man lying in the bed had thinning gray hair, a healing cut above his left temple, and a distant, clouded look in his eyes. Nurse Patel stood beside him, kind but brisk. He answers to Arthur sometimes, she said in a whisper. We're not certain it's his name, but it's a start. Miss Marple approached gently. Good morning, Arthur, she said softly. I wonder if you remember me. His eyes flicked toward her, alert for a moment, then drifted away. Again. She tried again. You tuned the Bechstein at Marleycombe Hall. You wore a green jacket. You had a red satchel. This time, something shifted. His fingers, thin, calloused, moved slightly, as if tapping invisible keys. Miss Marple watched carefully. Did someone stop you on the road that day? She asked. No response. Did someone say they needed help with their piano? Still nothing. But then his lips parted, and he said one word. Box. Her pulse quickened. What kind of box, Arthur? Did someone ask you to deliver one? But he'd closed his eyes again, and the moment was gone. That evening, back in Marleycombe, Miss Marple requested a quiet visit to the Kingsley Library. The room was still, thick with the scent of old books and fireplace ash. She moved to the desk. Thomas Brabham had once claimed as his. She examined the lower drawers. Most were empty now. The police had taken everything, but one felt. Odd. The bass didn't sound right when she tapped it. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small brass hairpin. With the precision of a woman who'd once mended lockets blindfolded for a church fundraiser, she wedged the pin into the corner. A soft click. The false bottom lifted. Inside. A single yellowed envelope. Handwritten. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, dated 1934, addressed to Henry Kingsley. The writing was faint, but clear. Dear Father, I know you wish to forget what happened in Brighton, but I cannot live with silence. If I must leave the family to protect your name, so be it. But the child must have something. Her name will not be Kingsley, but she will always be one. I beg you, send something when the time comes. Miss Marple closed her eyes. It was from Charlotte Kingsley, Alice's mother. This letter had been hidden for decades. Suppressed. Buried. And someone, likely Thomas, had found it when the drawer was broken into. No wonder he had panicked. This was more than a family scandal. It was proof of inheritance. Proof of deliberate. ERASURE. Miss Marple made a note to have the letter sealed and delivered to her solicitor. It was too important and too dangerous to leave in the house. She returned the drawer to its disguise. Satisfied, the ghost of the past had finally spoken. And soon, someone else would remember why the piano tuner had to be silenced. Chapter 18. The Man Beyond the Orchard. The orchard had always been a place of quiet. But that evening, just before dusk, Alice felt uneasy there. She'd taken to walking at sunset, a habit Miss Marple had gently encouraged. A way to feel free again, to reclaim space that once frightened her. But tonight, the trees felt too still, the breeze too quiet. She turned suddenly. A shadow moved, not close, not near the garden wall, but far beyond, where the hedgerow bent and the path dipped toward the gate. Someone was watching. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply turned and walked briskly back toward the house. 10 minutes later, Miss Marple sat across from her in the drawing room. Alice was pale but calm. He didn't move. He just stood there. What did he look like? Miss Marple asked. I couldn't see clearly. Tall, I think. Hat, maybe. Or dark hair. Could it have been someone from the village? Alice hesitated. It didn't feel like that. It felt intentional. Miss Marple understood immediately. Someone had come to see whether she was still here. Whether Alice had spoken to anyone. Whether she'd remembered everything. That night, Miss Marple returned to her notes. If Thomas had planned everything alone, the drugging, the framing, the manipulation, then why the piano tuner? Why the hidden drawer? Why had Thomas risked planting a false call and intercepting a man he couldn't have known was scheduled? Unless someone else had told him. Someone inside the household. Someone who had access to family appointments, documents, secrets. Someone who had remained invisible because they had played the part of loyal retainer. She thought back. Who had never been questioned? Who had remained at Marleycombe after Thomas's arrest? Who had worked quietly in the background and been there before Alice arrived? Mrs. Tilling. The housekeeper. Efficient, soft-spoken, always in black, always in motion. Can Miss Marple. Now recalled, always protective of Thomas. She remembered a moment. Just days after Alice disappeared, Mrs. Tilling whispering something to the constable in the hallway. Dismissing it as maid's chatter. Miss Marple had forgotten it. But now, it didn't feel like chatter. It felt like control. The next morning, Miss Marple went early to the village post office. "Miss Gresham," she said pleasantly, "could you tell me? Did Mrs. Tilling ever receive parcels from Dorchester? Or from London, perhaps?" The postmistress frowned thoughtfully. "Oh, yes, regularly. One came every third Friday. Plain brown paper. Books, I think, or music scores. She said it was for her nephew. Did she ever collect one for someone else?" "Oh, just once. Signed for a delivery meant for Mr. Brabham. I remember because she made a fuss about it being urgent." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was a chess game again. Thomas was clever, but he'd had a bishop in the background, and Mrs. Tilling had moved the pieces. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting untouched in her lap. At exactly 9:42 p.m. A shape moved across the orchard path, but this time Miss Marple was ready. The local constable, tipped off earlier, emerged silently from the shrubs. And Mrs. Tilling froze under torchlight. Caught, her gloved hands held a folded paper, a train ticket. To Dover. She was planning to run, but no. The game was up. Chapter 19. Loyalty in Black Misses. Tilling sat perfectly upright in the vicar's study. She had not wept, had not begged. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she stared at the bookshelf as though judging the dust. Not the questions. Constable Batley was red-faced, intense, pacing near the fireplace. Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Tilling, quiet, composed, knitting untouched in her bag. The silence stretched long before Miss Marple finally spoke. "You signed for a parcel meant for Mr. Brabham. What was in it?" Mrs. Tilling didn't blink. "I don't know." "That's not true," Miss Marple said gently. "You don't strike me as a woman who delivers things she hasn't inspected." Still, no answer. Then Miss Marple tried a different approach. "Did Thomas first tell you about Alice?" That got her. Mrs. Tilling looked up, just for a moment. And in that moment, Miss Marple saw it. Guilt, not hatred. Not panic. Just old, hard guilt. She spoke at last, voice low and flat. "He came to me after finding the box in the library. Said it contained something dangerous. I told him to burn it. But he'd already read it. Did you know what it meant?" Miss Marple asked. "I guessed. I'd been in this house long enough to know which children were spoken of and which weren't." Miss Marple nodded. "And what did he ask you to do?" Mrs. Tilling looked down at her lap. "To watch Alice, to find out if she knew more, to delay her. And when the piano tuner's appointment came up, he panicked. Said it was the day she planned to tell Eleanor everything. He was afraid the man might overhear something." "So you made the call," Miss Marple said softly. She nodded. "I told the tuner the appointment was canceled, but I didn't know Thomas had followed him. Not until afterward." There was a long pause. "And the drawer?" Miss Marple asked. Another pause. "I told him where to find the spare key." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "Why, Mrs. Tilling? Why risk everything for him?" The housekeeper finally looked at her. And this time the coldness was gone. There was only grief. "Because I raised him," she whispered. "More than his own mother did. I was the one who cleaned his cuts, put him to bed, stood in the corner when his father shouted. And when he became a man, I still saw the boy I protected." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Even when that boy became a liar?" Mrs. Tilling's lips trembled. "Yes," she said. "Even when he became a killer?" The answer came more slowly. And when it came, it broke. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Even then." Miss Marple didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands, because this, she knew, was the truest kind of tragedy. Not a man killed out of rage, not a girl silenced out of greed, but a life protected beyond reason. A love so blind, it refused to see the monster it had nurtured. Mrs. Tilling was taken into custody. That Night. No formal charges yet, but enough to keep her from running. Miss Marple stood in the doorway and watched the police car drive away. Felt no triumph. Only sorrow, because the most dangerous loyalties she had long learned are the ones wrapped in silence and stitched in memory. Chapter 20. The garden rose again. Summer began to slip into autumn. The edges of the roses browned gently, and the leaves above the Kingsley orchard turned gold. Village had quieted. People still whispered, of course. Marley Combe would always whisper, but the sharpness had dulled. The scandal had become a story, a cautionary tale. Thomas Brabham awaited trial. Mrs. Tilling was no longer mentioned in polite company. And Alice? She walked freely now. No longer the bridesmaid, no longer a mystery, just Alice Bridger, resident of Marley Combe, survivor, cousin, daughter of a forgotten branch. She and Eleanor worked together in the village hall, launching a small reading circle for girls who'd never known books beyond schoolwork. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. A future stitched back together, page by page. One Saturday, Alice came to the Elms alone. She brought a small potted rose, pale pink, with delicate edges. "It's for your garden," she said, placing it on the porch step. Miss Marple looked down at the little rose, then up at the young woman who had once been buried by silence. "Will it bloom again?" she asked softly. Alice smiled. "I think so," she said. "Some things do, even after frost." That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a shawl around her shoulders, a fresh letter on her lap. It was from the Dorchester Hospital. Arthur Littleton, the piano tuner, had recovered enough to remember his name. His sister had come down from Harrogate to collect him. He'd asked if the kind lady with the lace gloves was all right. Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it into her. Gerald. Another thread. Another silence lifted. Later, she stepped out into the garden. The moonlight caught the dew on the rose petals. She bent, lightly touched the bloom Alice had brought, and smiled, not because the mystery was solved, but because healing had begun. And that, she thought, was the greatest mystery of all. How hearts broke, and somehow found their way back to light. Behind her, the wind rattled the old gate. In the distance, the church bell chimed. And Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet heart, stood among the roses, listening always for what the world tried not to say. Because peace, like petals, was fleeting. And someone always would need watching.